Hello, everyone. I'm Ernie Humphrey, the CEO of Treasury Webinars. I would like to thank everyone for taking the time to join us for our webinar today, T&E Neglect, Productivity Lost, Fraud, Money Wasted. I would like to thank our webinar partner for today's webinar, Certify. Their commitment to thought leadership helps make this webinar possible today. At Treasury Webinars, we offer webinars designed to empower Treasury, accounts payable, and accounts receivable success at companies of all sizes. We only do what we do best, which is webinars. Now for the exciting housekeeping items. Anyone interested in receiving CTP credit for today's webinar, you'll have to remain on for the duration of the webinar, answer all the polling questions, and answer our post-webinar survey that will launch immediately after the webinar. If you have any questions regarding CTP credit, please send an email to ernie@treasurywebinars.com. Again, CTP credit questions, send an email to ernie@treasurywebinars.com. I'd like to hear from you today, and I can take your questions at any time in the questions area of the GoToWebinar control panel. I'll do my best to get to your questions if we have time for a Q&A session at the tail end of the webinar today. Fear not, if I do not get to your question, I will reach out with you directly to address your question. Finally, we appreciate your consideration in taking a short survey at the end of the webinar today, as we always strive to improve the ROI of your valuable time. What's our agenda for today? Well, first we're going to start out with why T&E matters. So oftentimes when we talk to this CFO or our C-suite leaders and try and get their attention as to why we want to focus on T&E, we have to explain to them why it matters. So even though T&E is the second largest operating expense, oftentimes making up 6 to 8% of our budget, even though it's probably the most complicated business process that we have, and it's the second most difficult to control. CFOs really don't pay enough attention to that, nor do we in Treasury and AP and Finance. And so let's talk about why T&E matters. And then we'll start to dig in. And really there's three pillars of effective T&E expense management. We have visibility, so we have to get that visibility right. Second pillar is benchmarking. We have to be able to benchmark our data, and then we have to have control. So how do we establish control over our spend, and how do we make people spend money as if it's their own? So we'll talk about T&E processing spending, why visibility matters. We'll talk about the art of controlling T&E spend. We'll talk about how to mitigate inefficiencies in T&E expense reporting, and then we'll talk about how to reduce T&E fraud exposures. So let's say, why does T&E matter? So T&E continues to rise. So from 2017 to 2018, the total amount of AAA spending grew to $305 billion, and that number is actually forecasted even higher in 2019 with the percentage trend in line as well. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. One is the economy is moving towards a subscription economy, so companies need to earn their customers' business, and that means more travel. There's also a new commitment to human capital development. That means more spending. There's more commitment to our supplier relationships. That means more spending. So it's great to see that in a digital world, we are recognizing the value of T&E spend. Also, as I previously mentioned, T&E spending ranks as the second most difficult operating expense category to control, so that deserves our attention. That means it's hard to even estimate what that might be. It means it's hard to control all of the risk, and many companies do not understand the risk associated with T&E. So let's talk about why T&E process and visibility. Let's talk about why it matters. Before we do that, let's go ahead and ask our first polling question here. And so really the first step in managing T&E effectively is really getting that visibility. And so what I always say is you can't manage what you can't see. So I'm just asking you to share with me how you would characterize the level of visibility your company has relative to T&E spend: poor, non-existent, decent, but you have blind spots, good, you can do better, optimal, real-time visibility, or maybe you're just not feeling any of those answers today. I appreciate everyone's consideration in answering all of our polling questions here today. Those of you interested in receiving CTP credits for today's webinar, you'll need to answer all of our polling questions. Let's go ahead and leave the polling question up for a few more seconds, then we'll take a quick peek at the results. I'll offer a little color commentary, and then we'll start to talk about the art of leveraging benchmarks. And so I see a lot of cursory commentary about benchmarks. I see webinars talk about they're going to discuss benchmarks, but they really never do it. No one ever tells us how to leverage those benchmarks. So how do we do it? And so we're going to dive into that today. So let's go ahead and close polling question. Go ahead and take a quick peek at the results. First and foremost, 13% of you, that's optimal. Congratulations to you. And for those of you that have this visibility and you have a solution in place, one of the things that we'll be doing to really speak directly to you is that you should make sure that you are receiving all dimensions of the ROI that you deserve for your investing in T&E expense management done right. So for you, the point is going to be, what can I do better? How can I get more value out of my system? And maybe you even want to look at another system if it's not delivering the results that you need. So 87% of you, we can do better. So let's talk about the value in doing so. And the 9% of you that don't know, that is your homework assignment for me. I encourage you to find out. So let's look at the art of leveraging benchmarks. And so just some actionable advice. So you want to focus on what matters. So for benchmarks, one of the areas where I suggest starting at the top level is category benchmarks. And so what are the main categories of spend that you have in terms of travel spend, maybe airfare? So we'll talk about some benchmarks. So focus on what matters, focus on what's driving your spend, and then also focus on areas when you're looking at your forecasts versus your actuals. What are things that are driving the variance between our forecast and actuals, and how do we do better? And then let's focus on benchmarking in those areas. And then also looking at areas which are driving costs. Those are areas we want to focus on to do better. And so one of the things we want to look at is two parts, right? The process part. So let's look at benchmarks, how long it takes us to do things, but also on the T&E spend, we need to start looking at the ROI of our T&E spend. So if you're spending in certain areas, what is the ROI to that in certain areas? So if you're spending on business meetings, product development, what's that ROI? You need to continually verify what matters. So it's just not, oh, I identified the drivers of spend, I need to keep on. Those are always going to be the same. That's not true. Maybe you have a shift in business conditions. Maybe you make an acquisition. Maybe there's changes in the way you travel, and so your travel policy changes. So let's verify that. We want to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples, and so we don't want to compare things that are different from each other and take actions based on a non-valid comparison that's going to cause us problems. So you want to compare your data over time. So you want to compare year over year. 2018, 2019, hey, 2019, I lowered something by 15%. Well, we got to take it a step further than that, right? We also have to look at comparing that data across industry. So you might have a 15% improvement, but a 15% improvement from horrible isn't really all that something to pat yourself on the back. So you want to look at trends over time and across industries. The good news is that companies like Certify are doing a fantastic job in serving the finance industry in offering us benchmarks that we have never been able to see before. So I encourage you to go to certify.com and check out some great research. And I'll mention a few of their research studies that I've been happy to be involved with over the past several years. You also want to look at the magnitude of trends when you're looking at your data. You want to look at the direction of trends, the up and down. You want to look at the variance in trends over time. So we're going up in certain areas. Why is that? Is that consistent with market conditions? Are we seeing people spend more money on gas? Does that make sense? Are we traveling more? Is the price of gas going up? And then we want to look at the drivers of these trends and look at what we can control, what we can't. What we can control. We want to look at levers for those drivers and really look at those correlations between those metrics. And then things we can't control, we just need to do the best that we can as far as estimating what those things might be. What kind of market intelligence can we get to make sure that we are able to do the best job that we can? So some of the research I want to talk about is the Certified Spend Smart Report, Year in Review Report. It looks at key business travel trends and expense benchmark. It tracks T&E spending benchmarks drawn from more than 3.3 billion expense transactions processed by Certify in 2018. In the report, it focuses on identifying leading expense categories, most expense brands, and who are earning the highest ratings. And so this report is extremely entertaining in addition to offering benchmarks. And so one of the things that you can do when you get visibility into that data and you get that reporting functionality, you can have some fun, some gamification. And so you can drive more efficient T&E spend, lower processing costs, but also have some fun in the process. And one of the great things about the Certify research is it's entertaining to read, and it takes a unique take, so it gets you interested. And the other thing that's been interesting is they really help us identify trends in travel. So one of the most interesting things that I've seen is how Certify was tracking how fast and how Uber was displacing taxi cabs and rental cars. And now they're taking the lead in that area and looking at things such as scooters. And so that's really kudos to them for serving our industry and helping us understand how we travel and then things that we need to track. So taking a look at these averages in terms of spend, these are categories I suggest that you track just to give some context. This chart shows a percentage of total annual transactions by expense category, so it's not necessarily cost, based on over 50 million receipts. And so we see most expense, meals at 17%. Look at that, ride hailing 15%. And so I'm going to tell you that when I looked at this research a few years ago, ride hailing wasn't tracked separately. So what we were seeing in the certified research was we were seeing things getting put into the miscellaneous bucket. And so you need to look at your categories and make sure that you're capturing the spend. And let's mitigate that miscellaneous category. And so I'm not surprised to see meals because I think Starbucks is getting put in there. And so that's going to really jack that up. If we look in terms of dollar spend, I would expect that we see airfare and hotel are going to be up at the top. But again, we want to see what our allocation is, how that's changing over time. We can dig into meals, and we'll talk about how to dig in on that research here and some of those interesting results. And here's some interesting results. Just average expense cost per category. You can compare this to your company, hotel, shipping, supplies. And here's some very valuable information. So we see the red is higher than 2017 averages, the black is lower. And so you should look to see if your company is following these trends. So this is good. So if you're not, if you're going the opposite direction, you might want to see what's going on with your company. For example, your folks might all be wanting to stay at the Ritz-Carlton, things like that. Or airfare should have been going down. All your people are flying first class when you start to dig in. So this helps you ask the right questions. So where do I need to look? So this is incredibly valuable information. And so I encourage you to track your expense spend by these categories and see, look at yourself year over year and see where you compare. And we can go even deeper. Well, I want to share, this is really cool. And this is a free resource to you. So you can do some back of the envelope calculations. So you can type in what your categories are once you're tracking those and compare those. Right there gives you a good back of the envelope calculation, quick answers to your questions, and it doesn't cost anything. So that's another thing I enjoy about working with Certify as a thought leadership partner. They have a commitment to developing tools that help us add more value at our companies, and that is unique. And so let's have a little fun. So let's look at the most beloved and popular brands in 2018 in terms of share of expense receipts. So we see that we have Uber at number 1 and Starbucks at number 2. I imagine if we look next year, we're not going to see Uber as high. There's been some issues with Uber in the press, and so I'm not surprised to see Starbucks there. And you can also see the airlines as well. So in T&E, what we want to do is make our travelers happier. And so if our folks aren't flying on Delta and American, we might want to suggest that they do so. So you may get benefits, right? You want your travelers to be happy. You want to maximize their experience. Maximizing their experience helps them be more productive. And that's really important in terms of looking at the efficiency of your T&E expense reporting processes. We don't want to frustrate our travelers. If we make T&E expense reporting easy for them and we get them their money back as quickly as possible, they are going to be happier, and that's going to impact productivity. And that certainly doesn't get enough attention from what I've seen. And so let's look at the most expense brands by category. Not surprising, we have Starbucks, 23%. Hotels, we have Hampton. Air, we have Delta, and ride hailing, Uber, that domination. I would expect that number to drop. I think Lyft is starting to take a bite out there, and I think Uber needs to make some changes and do some marketing, and we might see them hold that position, but we'll have to wait and see. But the good news is Certify will help us do that through these reports. And so In addition to the year in review report, Certify does these quarterly Spend Smart reports. And so you can go on their website and you can subscribe to that. It's just interesting. It's fun. You can share it with your travelers. They get a kick out of it. So highest rate brands by category. So in ride hailing, this makes sense to me. Lyft was higher than Uber. In air, we have JetBlue. We have Chick-fil-A. Boy, do we love that Chick-fil-A, right? So I don't know what it is, but I love it. I don't know why. I always think, how can a chicken sandwich taste so good? A commercial for Chick-fil-A, any of you Chick-fil-A employees out there. And then we have Marriott, and then we have National. So you might want to do this survey with your employees. It's just kind of fun. Ask them, right? How would you rate the brands? How would you rate the brands that you use? And so you can have some fun, and then you can start to see, hey, let's push our people towards these brands, and let's tell people we haven't had much luck with this brand. We want to make our travelers happy. And so looking at transportation trends, which really helps us, right? We need to understand how our folks are traveling so we can revise our policies accordingly. And so we look at the transportation trends. So we see Uber, Lyft, and taxi. And look at that. Taxi is 8% of that spend. So if we look back even 4 years ago, I think taxi was 80%, 70, 80%, if not more. And then we start to see the average. I would expected the variance between the taxi at 33 and 26 and 25 to be a little bit higher. And so again, just some interesting data that can be helpful to you in your policy and your controls, and just help you make your folks have an incentive to pay attention to the travel policy. And then if we look at ride hailing trends in North America, just some more research. I apologize if this might be a little difficult to see, but it's just this cool infographic on the Certified website. Just has a lot of information there, which is useful. Just kind of interesting. We have some information down here about scooters and what's going on in the scooter industry. So one of the things that you need to make sure of is that you understand how your folks are traveling. So in addition to Uber and scooters, we have folks maybe using Airbnbs and things of that nature. And so we need to make sure that we have control over what's going on, and we are directing our folks to most effectively use their time, but also, So let's go ahead and look at, this is interesting that we start to see food delivery grows. So this, I think, is an area of opportunity. So if you look at how much money your company, your people are spending, so you go to your hotel room, you go to a nice hotel, how much does room service cost? Well, let's start to educate our employees and by cities and say, hey, do you know in New York City, you're staying here, there's Grubhub, Uber Eats, DoorDash, Postmates, and these other things, and tell folks that that's something that you might want to consider. You can expense that, right? So this is a way to help us be more efficient, and also the food is going to be better. I almost guarantee it. Even room service at a really nice hotel, it's nothing nothing to write home about, in my opinion. And so this is more fun. So this is what I call T&E expenses gone wild from Certify. They do a craziest expenses survey every year. So this is just fun, and you probably have your own stories here to share. Here's a couple. Someone purchased a human skull. It was for a medical experiment, so that was approved. Here's me, helicopter ride to work, right? Needed to make a client meeting. That was not approved. You had to go back to the hotel to address your time in jail or pay your court fees. I would not suggest you do that. We have llama rental. That was approved. They wanted llama in the picture. Towed vehicle. So you had to make your company meeting, and that was approved. Good for you, the company that approved that. Separate hotel for your vegetables. You didn't want to smell that. Well, that's kind of a personal problem, so we didn't approve that. I would have approved that because I want my salesman to be happy, but that's just me. Share concert tickets. That was approved. I say you should always approve share concert tickets. So I would approve that. I would love to see Cher in concert. In Vegas, they have great concerts. I did see Backstreet Boys and Celine Dion. So let's take our customers there. It's worth it. Boarding for a pet snake. Yeah, we approve that. Oh, we got our customer an $8,000 Rolex watch, even though they might have deserved it. We can't have that. So just interesting. So how do we control spend? And how out of control is it, right? You need to take a look in the mirror. So let's talk a little bit about how do companies control spend? Different ways. 21% of companies based on historical spending, 29% follow GSA per diem guidelines, 30% determine annual budget process, 13%, oh, heartburn time, you have no expense category limits. Please, if you have expense category, don't have those, please, let's get those in place. And it's good if you determine it by your annual budgeting process, unless you do what I did when I was back in finance. Don't tell on me. Was we just said, oh, we'll raise that number by 3%, 4%, 5%. Let's use the annual budget process, but let's look at the benchmarks. Let's look at how we're spending our information. Let's challenge our managers, the ROI. You're spending this. What's the ROI? Let's start to rank where we spend our money on T&E into these different categories. I like GSA per diem guidelines. I would say both. Use GSA per diem guidelines in addition with your annual budgeting process. And again, I cautioned folks earlier about based on historical spending. You can go up and down. You can go down and say, hey, we're reducing spend by 10%. Well, you were out of line by 500%. So let's not pat ourselves on the back. So a key pillar of managing expense and controlling your expenses is your T&E policy. So just going to go ahead and launch our next polling question here, asking you to share with me if your company has a formal T&E expense policy. So I'm not going to leave this poll up very long, just kind of a yes/no question, just kind of benchmarking where we're at in the audience to see how deep I need to dive and where I need to start this conversation in terms of your T&E policy, and also just want to level set regarding what I've seen in the research in this area in terms of companies and whether or not they have a formal travel policy. So I'm going to give us another few seconds or so. Appreciate everyone's consideration in answering all of our polling questions. Again, those of you interested in receiving CTP credit, you'll have to answer all of our polling questions. Let me give you just a few more seconds because people get really cranky when I close the polling question and they haven't answered it yet. So I'll give you a few more seconds. All right, here we go. Let's go ahead and take a quick peek. So we had 83% of you. Yes, that's awesome. That's the first step. 17% of you know or not sure. That's something we need to find out. If you don't have one, I strongly suggest that you have one. The good news is there's a lot of free resources and templates out there to write one. Certify is one place where you can find some amazing templates. What we see in the research, we see that it's above 70%. If you look more broadly, there's only 75%, I think, or so companies have a policy. And so, what does an effective T&E policy look like? And so, if you have a policy, if you should review that every year. I think even more. Some companies I've spoken to at conferences, they do it every quarter. That's amazing. And you should review this with your travelers, right? You should do a review of it, and then you should review it with all of your travelers, all of your managers, everyone that's involved in improving spend or spending money, right, for your company on T&E. And so what do we need? You need clear and simple to follow for all your employees. They have to know the rules, why you're making the rules, and they need to know that they're accountable for the rules. And your managers need to be accountable for making their folks obey the rules, right? You need up-to-date rules, partners, and then some discounts in there. We need to make sure that we allow for certain things. You might be in a certain industry where your travel policy may be a little bit different because of the way you do business. You want to have a goal to manage the average traveler within the organization. Some folks are going to be travel pros, and some folks are going to need a little more help. So we want to manage the average traveler. We also want to look at those that need a little more help, but the average traveler is really where to level set there. You need to allow for reasonable accommodations, and so we want to have a strict policy, but depending on your industry and your employees, we should allow. We don't want to negatively impact our folks, especially our sales folks. We need to let them do their jobs. We need to have clear explanations for limits and restrictions. What happens if there's any ambiguity? Guess what? They're going to take advantage of it, and that's going to fall on you because that limit wasn't clear. Let's be clear. And then we need to make sure that the policy is legally compliant with IRS standards and other regulations. So let's make sure that we are in compliance where we need to be. And then here's questions that you should ask in reviewing your policy, or if you're going to set one up. If you're not in control of T&E, let people that are putting the policy together, let's get the lay of the land, right, and see where we are and how we can do better. So you want to find out, how is your travel booked? What is your process for employee reimbursements? How complicated is it? How many people are involved? The process systems. Who's responsible for booking travel? On average, how many days in advance is travel booked? What's the average cost of travel? What's the level of travel being booked? Are we letting people do all these upgrades? Who's overseeing uh, approving book travel? On average, how many employees are being booked for each trip? So this helps you raise your IQ. So we need to get the lay of the land, and then we start to see benchmarks, right? What do we always say on our webinars? We need to take a good look in the mirror, see where we're at, get some information, benchmarks, determine where we can get to, and in the middle, how are we going to get there? And what's the ROI to getting better? And that helps us make that business case and communicate with impact. So how do you drive compliance? And so it really doesn't matter if you have an outstanding policy if no one is complying with your policy, right? And so there's some pillars here. You should leverage technology to enforce compliance. So the leading T&E automation solutions, you can actually put hard stops and stop spend before it happens, or you can have what I call a soft stop, where there just might be a warning, or there's a message sent to someone's manager or even up to the CFO if things happen. So I got to see this in person. I was out to dinner with the client. They were showing me how their solution worked. Doom showed me, scan the receipts, OCR, started populating the report. Amazing. Hit the button. Red flag, not approved. And then she's like, oh. And then she's like, oh, that's actually good because the person forgot to add me. And so the amount of spend on the dinner was actually too high because it was based on per person. So that was a hard stop. And so that was amazing to me. So you can really program almost as much of your policy as you like into your automation solution. So that really drives that compliance. So obviously we want to have 100% compliance. And I always make this point. Out of policy compliance is T&E fraud, in my opinion. So let's set that mindset. If you're out of compliance, that's fraud. Fraud has to have consequences, right? Monetary is the best. We don't want to scare people too much, but we want to get that mindset. Spend money like it's your own. It seems so easy, but it doesn't happen. You need to educate business travelers and all managers who approve T&E expenses, right? We're expecting our managers a lot of times to understand those limits and be cognizant of what they are. And so the managers have to have accountability. If the percentage of compliance, of non-compliance spend is really high in your department, that has to have consequences to that manager. We got to motivate them. Again, you should review your T&E policy with all employees at least annually. Here's things that I don't think that people do enough of. You should deliver easy access to your T&E policy. Let's have that online. Let's also have FAQs online so people can get their questions answered, and so it'll alleviate frustration. We want happy travelers, right? And especially on our managers. So we want to optimize the T&E IQ of every person that travels and every manager. And then we want to develop that culture of accountability. These are the rules. You follow the rules or you pay the price. And so what are some incentives to drive compliance? You can have monetary rewards, you can have point systems, contests, and then you can have penalties as well. So just some specific ways. You can get really creative with these things, and so you can actually have some fun here. Now, how do we mitigate inefficiencies in T&E expense reporting? So when you start to look at how much it actually costs your company to process an expense report, you might pass out. So have your smelling salts ready. So it's good because once you map things end to end, you'll start to see areas of opportunity where there's time being wasted and there's money being wasted. So things you need to consider: hours to review, create, and approve reports. So you want to look at it from your traveler's perspective, your accounting perspective, your manager's perspective. So there's all these different layers, and we need to look at the time spent on all levels. So when our travelers are spending time arguing with accounting, arguing with their bosses back and forth about an expense report gone wrong, that is time we need to track, and we need to make sure that we benchmark that. Hard cost if you're using paper, printing, postage, time required for that reconciliation I mentioned, and the reimbursement. When I was in Treasury, every sales meeting, here come the sales guys. Why does it take me so long to get reimbursed? Good question. We should mitigate that time. We want to control how quickly they get reimbursed. We want happy travelers. Happy travelers mean more productive employees. And then again, I mentioned, lost productivity and lost opportunity. So every minute that your sales guy is on the road and he's doing print and paper receipts, getting irritated, putting GL codes in there, guess what? That's lost opportunity for your company for that top line growth, and we don't want that. So just to take a little deeper dive for you to get a sense, if you've never really done a deep dive here, you can start to look at the pain points, build that cost up, and then opportunities for improvement. And if you don't know these pain points, let's go and talk to our people. Let's ask the people. Let's ask our travelers. How long does it take you to do your expense report? What is it that you find frustrating? Do we have you entering stuff in Excel? Are we making you print stuff? Are we making you sign stuff? Travelers, what can I do to make your life easier? Seems so simple, but it's extremely powerful. Ask them what they need and give it to them. Managers, let's take their perspective. What are they doing? Did they receive reports different times of the month? How do we make that easier? How do we avoid the bottlenecks? Are we expecting our managers to manually audit all these reports? Do they need to be doing that? Can we use an automated tool? Let's look at that error process. What happens, between our employees and our managers? How much time are we wasting? How good are our managers at making sure that they don't approve out of policy compliance? That's fraud. On our friends, the accountants, oh boy, would we like to make their lives easier, because these guys don't get a lot of credit. They do a lot of work. Did they receive reports from employees at different times of the month or quarter? Non-timely admission of reports? Do we expect them to check receipts out of policy manually? Do we expect them to manually match receipts with line items, manually enter the data in the accounting software, and then enter it into payroll? So, and then are we leveraging things where we can push data? So are we leveraging, for example, a T&E card where we can automatically push data into for journal entries? In the T&E automation solutions, you can actually assign GL codes to certain areas. And so, boom, we could send that to accounting. It automatically puts the GL code. Why do we want travelers putting GL codes? Come on, people. Yeah, we still do that. We could do better. All right, let's take a look and set the technology landscape here, because the right technology is certainly an inherent barrier to managing T&E effectively. So let's take a look. If you'll share with me what the primary system is that you use to manage T&E expenses. Is it Excel? Is it a homegrown solution? Is it an ERP or ERP module? Is it a cloud-based T&E expense management solution? Or maybe you don't have any, maybe you use paper, or you don't know. So let's capture those answers in that area. And so I appreciate everyone's consideration in answering about polling questions. A reminder, I can take your questions in the questions area in your GoToWebinar control panel. I have been deeply steeped in T&E expense efficiency over the past probably 4 or 5 years, and so I have a pretty good depth of knowledge, so I encourage you to tap into my expertise. If you don't want to do so today, please reach out to me. Happy to answer your questions. You all probably have my email address. I encourage you to connect with me on LinkedIn as well. So let's take a quick peek here. Let me go ahead and close that and then take a quick peek. I am extremely encouraged on one level. We have 34% of we only have 15% in Excel. Congratulations. That's a golf clap for all you guys. So we see a lot of folks in the ERP and ERP module. So what I like to tell folks is ERP and ERP modules, maybe the module was designed to manage T&E, but it doesn't work. And so you can do better. And so I look at a T&E automation solution as a way to supercharge the value of your ERP. So our ERP is absolutely valuable in helping us benchmark data, track data, do our journal entries, but it really wasn't made for T&E. And again, as you start to look at the end-to-end process, it's extremely complicated, and the ERP system was not built to optimize that process flow. And then 34% of you already have a cloud-based system. That's a good start. However, you need to make sure that you're getting all the value that you deserve. And you have to also make sure that your folks are using all the functionality. I get frustrated when I see some of the survey results. And so you see you have a solution, and then we ask you where you're getting ROI from that. And we get a main functionality. I get ROI from this feature, 20%. It's like, what is going on? You need to use it. So buy it, use it. Make sure your folks are using it. It doesn't help if it's not being leveraged. You want to optimize that ROI, because really, we really don't have many chances in finance to have a career-defining project, right? If you do T&E done right, you are going to make a tremendous impact. You're going to lower cost. You're going to impact productivity. You're going to make every traveler more happy. How powerful is that? And so it can really be a career defining moment if done right, especially if you are a little bit behind the curve in your T&E practices. So thank you very much, everyone, for answering that polling question. And so just to see where you guys sit compared, look, you see you guys are only 15%. For what T&E Trends report, 33%, right? So we had a lot more people in the ERP and ERP module. I'm just hoping that people aren't going from Excel to their ERP module, because that's really, if you've done it, you can do better. And so I like to see that we're going away from Excel, but if we're going to make an improvement, let's not give ourselves a false sense of security and pat ourselves on the back for going to a solution in that we can do a lot better. And so let's take a look at trends by company size, just some interesting more data from Certify, so you can see where you fit by company size. Not surprisingly, what we see is more web-based solutions for bigger companies, but the trends are going in the right directions. And so what I'll tell you is the value proposition is incredibly powerful no matter what size company that you have. So let's look at some features, right? If you're going to have this investment, even if you have a solution already, it's not all that difficult. It's not completely easy, but you can change solutions, and if you can do better, right? If it's customer service, if it's functionality, let's look at the ROI to having best-in-class solution. So what do we want? We want simplicity, ease of use for our employees. We want to have tools that allow us to improve on-time submission, compliance, and we need to drive employee adoption. So that's not a must-have feature. That's us. We need to do that. We want automated features. We want to have efficiency. We want to give our folks their time back. We want to reduce their frustration, reduce the cost. We want to have mobile functionality. We want to have OCR receipt capture and other things along those lines. There are solutions that start auto-populating reports. Amazing, and it's almost getting to the point of artificial intelligence, and we'll get there eventually, but it's like you can start to recognize what it is. Boom, it'll automatically choose the right category. If you make a error in the GL code and it's a common error you made before and it's been fixed manually, it'll fix it for you. You want to make sure you have integrability with your other business systems. So we want to make sure we have integrability with our ERP again. We want to supercharge our ERP, and then corporate credit card fees and T&E card fees. Those are incredibly powerful to leverage in helping our accounting folks. We want to make sure that we have analytics, and so we want to understand where bottlenecks are happening. We want to look at how we're doing things, the time it takes, and also we want to look at how we're spending by category, department, employee, and then be able to do that benchmarking, be able to start to look at the trends in the data, be able to dig in on the analysis, do that analysis of variance, and see what's driving those variances. Again, focus on things we can control, do the best we can with things we can't control, and focus on what matters. So I kind of touched on this earlier. We see how the ROI was generated. You should be getting ROI from all of these features. You should be getting efficiency. If your expense report process efficiency doesn't go up after you've invested in a solution, you need a different solution, right? If you haven't reduced your processing costs, you should get another solution, right? But you should have value for mobile accessibility. It should make people more productive if they're using it. We need to have increased employee productivity. Shame that number should be a lot higher. Travel booking, reduction in overhead. I do want to note that these results are based on surveys of non-certified customers. So, and in some of the research that's done by Certify, in order to make it as unbiased as possible and not looking at transaction level data, they survey folks that aren't customers. And so I have no doubt if this were certified data in the other report we were looking at earlier, the SpendSmart report, these numbers would be a lot higher. And a couple areas where we're starting to see a lot of value and a lot of focus is the booking part. So travel control, integrated services, this is an area you want to look at. Focus on that functionality with your solution. If you don't have it, you want to look at a solution that does. And then kind of a cool thing that I found interesting was there's functionality in Google where you're traveling from A to B. You can make sure people aren't fudging on their mileage. This is another one. I have to say it one more time. Only 22% reduction in fraudulent expenses. Really? Come on. But these are all things where you should be seeing that ROI. So you need to challenge your partner, right? If you're not seeing all these areas. So how do we reduce T&E fraud exposures? I like to keep it simple, right? People, process, technology, right? The people, if they have the chance to commit fraud, they're going to do it. What are they going to have? Fictitious, overstated, mischaracterized, or duplicate expenses. What's going to cause fraud exposures? Our process, we have ineffective controls and oversight. We might not be able to identify out-of-policy expenses. Are we even tracking it? Our technology, do we have holes there? Do we have ineffective or manual audits and control? So let's start to look at those, identify that we have them, and then let's talk about how we mitigate those. So what are some preventative measures? Of course, you need to implement a formal written travel and expense policies. You need to train your travelers on your policy and establish that accountability. You need to enforce all of your T&E policy provisions. They have to be enforcement and accountability, and you need to implement cost management measures. So you need to do that benchmarking. You need to actively hold yourself to that level of accountability. And so let's go ahead and wrap things up with a few closing thoughts. So visibility into T&E process and spend is critical for T&E expense management. Leveraging benchmarks is a valuable tool in managing T&E expenses. Again, in terms of benchmarks, what we want to see, we want to look at benchmarks over time and across industries. An effective T&E policy is a key pillar of T&E expense management, and the right technology in conjunction with employee education mitigates fraud exposures while driving T&E policy compliance. I want to share with you some additional resources that you have access to. So several resources, if you'd like a copy of the presentation, all of the hyperlinks are there. So we talked about the Spend Smart report, there's infographics, the year in review, there's that Spend Smart benchmark calculator, the trends report that we mentioned, which is based on non-customer data from Certify. And then, of course, we all want to have fun with our craziest expenses survey. We also have a lot of other great resources on the Certify website as well. And so you'll be amazed if you've never gone to the website to see all the research that's out there, and it's free. When I was back in finance, if we wanted research, we had to pay tens of thousands of dollars for that research. So let's go ahead and take a few questions that we have, and then we'll wrap things up for today's event. And so getting some questions. So let's take one on adoption. So people are having concerns about how we're going to get the adoption of this. And so I always give this answer. So you should ask your people that travel, are you frustrated with how long it takes you to have an expense report? Would you like to get paid faster? Yes. Yes. Okay, there's your buy-in right there. The other thing is you can have a kind of a rollout strategy. So some companies that I've talked to, they engage their most tech-savvy travelers and they get them to roll that out first. And then what happens is all the time, it's pretty amazing, is that people find out that you're using this technology and they want it. So it's not like you have to force people to do it. They come clamoring for it. And then if you're going to get people to pay attention for a meeting, serve them food, right? It seems like common sense, but if you want people to pay attention, you need to have the food. Another question around, how do I coordinate reviewing my policy with all my travelers, right? And so what I would do is there's a couple ways. One is you can have a meeting, you can have on-demand presentation, and you can track whether or not someone has completed that training. And so you can make that available online. Take advantages. So if your sales team is having meetings, excuse me, they're going to be some of our most consistent, travelers and make up a good part of our population, right? And so we want to make sure we take advantage of those. And those face-to-face interactions are really important on that front. And so another thing that I wanted to point out, someone is mentioning this in a question or two, is a great point. And so one of the things that really wasn't mentioned on the ROI side was payments cost. And so if you are cutting reimbursement checks to your folks instead of using direct deposit or ACH, there's a tremendous amount of value to that. So checks are 10 times as more costly to process as an ACH or a direct deposit. And there's also a lot of risk exposures with checks. The AFP just released their annual frauds and control survey, and what we found was checks are still the most prevalent area of fraud at, I believe, 74%. The next highest category of expense of payment type is about 40 or 45%. And so we need to pay attention to those specific areas. And so let me consolidate a few of these questions. Some of these are around fraud. So I made this point, and I always make this point when I talk about fraud exposures in spend management. It's all about the education. And so low-hanging fruit is education. And so you want to educate all your folks that are involved in the process, right? Where these exposures are, their impact on them, but you also have to let people know that you're watching, right? We're watching you, and this is what's going to happen. These are going to be the consequences of our action. A few questions around, are there company size and industries where we're seeing more adoption? In general, we are seeing adoption across all company sizes. And the business case, if I haven't done a good job of laying out the dimensions of the business case, are so T&E done right, specific areas, we are going to lower those invoice processing costs. So you need to estimate what yours are, right? Benchmark that about what you see in the industry level. Look at the improvement that you can make. In most cases, not most cases, in some cases, you're going to T&E done right. If you're not out in the front of the curve, you're going to be able to save $10 or more per report. Multiply that. Pretty powerful. You want to look at the time lost, manual processes, arguing back and forth, geocodes, travelers. And so when you start to say that, you need to go into that. And so some other questions here around your T&E policy compliance, outstanding point. And so you have these category limits, right? And you might have to have some flexibility in those based on where someone's traveling. So I'm from Indiana, right? So if I'm going to have dinner in Indiana, it's not going to be the same as San Francisco. If I'm at a hotel, it's going to be different. So we have to accommodate those. And so we may have to do that in our reporting. And so some of our limits and some of our benchmarking, again, we might be like, this is a good point, you might want to be apples to apples. So we might look at our departments and say, look at John. John spends $400 on a hotel, and Jim spends $20. Like, don't we wish? $200. What's going on? Oh, John travels to San Francisco. So that's an absolutely amazing question. Thank you so much. And so when we're looking at analysis, we need to be a little bit careful. And the good part is, if you're doing that analysis, you would have immediately identified that as driving that variance. And so when we're looking at our benchmarks, we need to make sure that we maybe we have to do some normalization based on our city to do that comparison. And so some people are asking me about, my sales guys need to do X, Y, Z, and I don't need to have benchmarks, and they don't need to be accountable. I've had this conversation many times, and then my answer is, yes, you do. So you have to have controls on those limits. You have to be flexible, but you have to explain. And so if someone says, this is the way it's done in our industry, well, let's verify that, right? We don't want to put your company at a competitive disadvantage, but we need to look at what's the ROI, right? If we're gonna do things a little bit more loosely, we are gonna have an upper limit. That's just the way it needs to be. Now, if you're going out of line with these policies, let's have some controls. Let's make sure if you're going to go way out of line, or maybe we just have a little bit more exceptions for certain sales guys that are in certain territories and they need more flexibility. But that expense is going to need to get approved by the CEO or CFO, or there's going to be an email sent. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is we are trying to control that spend before it happens. And then in terms of questions around some best practices in revising your policy. So when you're doing that annual review, I strongly encourage you when I was at a corporate, we had a travel committee, and so we had a member of these 5 or 6 folks, and they were responsible for managing revisions to the policy, making sure the policy was in line. So we had someone from finance, someone from travel, someone from sales, I'm sorry, someone from operations. And so we want to make our travelers involved in putting our policy together, and that helps us with accountability. And so if folks are involved, how mad do the sales guys get when they see, hey, a policy limit of $200 on that? Well, how does that happen? Well, your VP of sales was in on the policy, and we had that discussion, and he told us, da da da, so you have a voice, right? So everyone feels like they have a voice. If you feel like you have a voice in the game, right, then you're gonna be more. Then you're gonna feel like your interests are being taken care of, and you're gonna know that it's reasonable for you to have that compliance. And so questions around international travel, my people travel overseas, are these solutions in foreign languages and foreign currencies? The answer is yes on all fronts. So you'll be amazed at how robust these solutions are, and the functionality and the investments in really always looking to add more value. So I mentioned a few of them. And so the one that we're seeing now is especially on the travel booking side. So when you start to look at, do you have folks out there on Priceline? Do you have folks out there that make their hotel reservations? Do you have unused airline tickets? And so what we see is, now that we've got the visibility into these things, we are always looking for continuous improvement, and leading companies are looking for opportunities to continually offer that value. And so with your provider, if you are looking or choosing one or looking to choose, look at how they do their development. How do they invest in that? How do they take feedback from their customers? Do they do this internally? How do they serve, right, you as a professional? And so I'm starting to see this more and more. I have another company called 360 Thought Leadership Consulting, and companies are starting to invest in thought leadership. If I was doing a selection on a provider, I would want a company that is committed to thought leadership, respects my attention, gives me customer service, right, and is proactive instead of reactive. And so I think that's tremendously important. Again, a few more questions like we always get. How do I get my CFO to pay attention to this? Let's go back to why T&E matters. Remind your CFO this is 6 to 8, 10% of my budget, right? Oh, okay. Well, that got my attention right there. Also, you need to communicate that T&E, the complication, right, of the T&E process from end to end. People, process, technology. This deserves our attention. It's the most complicated process, which means there's more places for inefficiencies, which, and the other part is good, because we also have opportunities for improvement. And so you really need to understand the cost of doing things wrong. What is that neglect costing our company? And sometimes we have to frame it in a negative way to get a positive reaction, right? A positive attention. So sometimes we need a little scare tactics. Do you know if we continue to have inefficient T&E practices, that this is going to have a $2 million impact to our bottom line? Aren't we supposed to support growth? How nice would it be to say, wow, I just saved and it's ongoing, right? I saved the company $2 million. We save the company $2 million a year. That's ongoing, right? And so the other part where I see people are asking, my thoughts on where I see things going, I think we're going to see more focus, and we need to pay more attention to the ROI of T&E spend. And so it's not necessarily about having an aggregate total that's different. We like to see it trend downward, but that has to fit with our goals and our business goals. And so we don't want to reduce T&E so much that it's impacting the value we offer our customers and our shareholders. And so we need to start to look at why, right? Why are we traveling places? So we're going to see more benchmarking. Unfortunately, the most recent study I've seen on the ROI of T&E spend is from like 2014. And so I'm actually trying to work with Certify to really start to do some research in this area and show the power, right? So we want to mitigate our invoice processing costs, right? But we want to maximize the ROI of our T&E spend. So let's make educated decisions on our T&E spend. Let's not just raise our year over year budget. Okay, let's not say raise it 5%, raise it 4%, raise it 3%. The other thing which is important to communicate is that it's the second most difficult expense to control. And so one of the things that we might not communicate well enough to our CFOs is we are mitigating risk. When we see things in the news about fraud, we start to see these. How are we? So just explain the risks that are going on. And so once you get your house in order, right? Let's get our house in order. Let's get the lay of the land, and let's see, um, you know, where we can get to once we get things in order with the people, process, and technology that we have right now. And so I would just say, in closing, I'm just going to go ahead and launch our final polling question as I make a few comments that T&E and a more broad category of expense management that deserves your attention. The business case for T&E done right almost makes itself, but you need to communicate that business case with impact. And so you need to find the passion that I have for the topic and really lay things out, right? In terms you can use positive. So just that business case is incredibly impactful, right? Impacting the bottom line, impacting the top line, impacting productivity, making everyone happier, right? Impacting the employee experience so you can show that you're delivering value across the enterprise. So I'm going to go ahead and let's go ahead and close our final polling question. And I would like to once again thank our sponsor, Certify, for their commitment to thought leadership. And I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a heads up. So coming soon from Treasury Webinars and Illumio, we are going to launch a corporate treasury certification, going to be focused on technology, relationships, and career success. I helped write the CTP certification book that they use for the base of the exam, but this is different. This is way different. It's practical. It's what you really need to know really to drive your career success. So career success in Treasury and finance going forward is about embracing technology, right? Not being afraid of technology and building relationships, effective business, partnering across the enterprise. Finally, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for your valuable time today. I appreciate each and every one of you. Make the rest of your day great, everyone.